Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the setup changes I've made so far to my Kyosho Lazer ZX6. Basically, there are 3 racetracks in my region that I generally go to. There's Cruisin' with RCs in New Jersey, there's RCHR in Connecticut, and there's Walcott Hobby and Raceway also in Connecticut, very close to RCHR. Primarily, I've been racing this particular buggy at Walcott and trying to get it set up on that surface. And the Walcott track is, I'd say, a medium to large size track for 10th scale. And the way the jumps are designed, they're very smooth and flowing, and you have some high-speed sweepers and some tight hairpins. And what I noticed with the stock setup on this car is that the suspension itself does not have enough pack, and also the rear end is quite a bit loose. Now the rear end could be loose because I'm using electrons instead of slick tires like primes or smoothies. Most of the people there use slicks or worn electrons, like you can see up front here. The electrons are completely worn. I think once the rears start to really wear in, so to speak, then I'd have more rear grip. But I'll get to that in a minute. The pack part is significant because after, this is maybe 3 race weekends or so, the chassis protector is pretty much eaten through here at the front and a little bit at the rear. I'd expect this at the rear. I'd had, similar rear wear problems on my 22.4. So, so far the chassis isn't completely ground through. It's not too bad. But at the front, I really noticed, anytime I land a jump, the front would sort of smack the ground, kind of like a B44 does. So I tried to move the shocks to the inner hole, because the stock setup uses the middle hole here. I moved it to the inner hole to get a little bit more front droop, and that helped out a bit, but it didn't really do quite enough. So what I ended up doing is taking the pistons out and replacing them with 4 by 1.3 millimeter pistons. You could use any brand you want. I happen to use Team Associated pistons because I just had them available, but any type should work fine. Those are all machined pistons, so it shouldn't be a problem. So I went to 4 by 1.3s, 35 weight front oil, 30 weight rear oil, and in terms of the pack, that really seemed to help quite a bit. So I'm happy with that. And then the next things I had to deal with, or wanted to deal with, were the front steering response and the rear grip. So with the rear grip, again, some of it's the tires, but also even with the right tires, it still can be a little bit slidey. So there are 2 ways you can deal with that. One way is to increase the rear camber gain, and you can do that by, say, moving the light in here, moving that ball stud to the inner hole. So let me make sure I hold on a second here. Move this light. Okay, so you can move that ball stud to the inner hole. That will reduce the camber link length, thus increasing camber gain, so that when the suspension compresses, the camber goes more negative. So on a lateral load, you get more side bite. That would help, but would also make the car a little bit more twitchy. Another thing you can do is to drop the rear roll center. And you can do that by raising the height of the ball stud on the inside and or dropping the height of the ball stud on the outside. So what I ended up doing was dropping the outer ball stud height. I think it came with 1 or 2 millimeter spacer in there. I just took it out, dropped the ball stud down, and that helps the rear roll a little more rather than slide, because I had this sliding problem with the rear. So I dropped the roll center, helps it roll a little more. That helps quite a bit with rear grip, even with these not fully slick electrons. So I'll keep that as it is for now. And then as far as the steering response is concerned, I did 2 things. One thing I did was to, let me make sure I got this right. Do this, yeah, so I dropped the front roll center by raising the inner camber link ball stud height by 1 millimeter. So it comes when you assemble the kit. I believe it comes with, or you have to use a 1 millimeter spacer here under the ball stud. I just switched that out for a 2 millimeter spacer, so increase the ball stud height, roll center drops. That will make the front a little more lazy, transitioning from side to side. So that'll help slow down the steering response a little bit, because the Lazer has a ton of initial steering. So that helps. The other thing that helps is to change the Ackermann. So the steering rack on the Lazer is set up such that the ball stud for the steering link comes out like this. And there are no spacers in it with the stock setup. So what I did was add a 1 millimeter spacer to the ball stud. That pushes this ball stud out so that when the steering is at full throw, the angle of this steering length is lower. As you can see here at full throw, it's actually at an angle, but it's at a lower angle than what it would be without that spacer. You can imagine if I just had an imaginary ball stud that could go really far out, then that would make this link completely straight. Okay, so what ends up happening is at full throw, you can see the inside wheel throws more than the outside wheel. Now, without this 1 millimeter spacer, this Ackermann effect is even more profound. This angle would be even larger than the outside wheel angle. So I reduced that a little bit, and I dropped the front roll center, and that seemed to, at least on the surface I'm on the track that I'm racing on, it helped quite a bit. Now, I only was able to run this car for about 2 laps before I hit a barrier and snapped the steering rack. As you can see right here on this side. And I did point out in the build series that the steering rack could be a problem because there's no integrated servo saver in the steering rack, and all the servo horns are solid, so there's really nothing to give in terms of collision forces are concerned. I was quite surprised to see this happen because I've actually beaten this car up pretty badly. I've had some interesting crashes with it, I'll say. So I was a bit shocked, but at the same time not completely surprised that the steering rack broke. Everywhere you look pretty much has these out of stock, so I had to go on eBay and find a few pairs or sets so I could have a replacement and then 1 or 2 backups. So definitely watch out for this. That's the first part that I really broke on this chassis. But otherwise, this chassis is very strong. I haven't broken any suspension arms. I haven't broken the bulkhead or the towers or anything like that. Just this piece here on the steering rack. So that would be one spare part to get if you can get your hands on it. So these are the setup changes I've made. I readily admit that I only put a few laps on the car with those setup changes, but I did notice that the car felt much easier to drive on that surface. So once I fix the steering rack, of course I'm going to take this out again, but keep these things in mind. If you have your own ZX6 and you're finding that it's loose or whatever, or it's too much steering, try these things out, and you might be pleasantly surprised. Okay, so that's all I have for this right now, and thanks for watching.